Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for attending this book talk, The 7 Sins of Memory, Updated Edition, How the Mind Forgets and Remembers, with Professor Dan Schechter. My name is Elissa Spitzer, and I'm the Senior Fellow in Law and Applied Neuroscience with the Project on Law and Applied Neuroscience. The Project on Law and Applied Neuroscience is a collaboration between the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Massachusetts General Hospital, also known as CLBB, and the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School, also known as PFC. A bit more on each of these. CLBB promotes and enables the sound application of accurate neuroscience to critical areas of the legal process through a unique partnership involving MGH, Harvard Medical School, Harvard Law School, and faculty experts across many Boston area schools. CLBB's primary focus is to provide the legal system with frameworks and tools derived from neuroscience and complementary areas of research to make better legal decisions and provide better legal services in order to ensure justice and fairness for everyone affected by law. PFC is a research program dedicated to the unbiased legal and ethical analysis of pressing questions facing health policymakers, medical professionals, patients, families, and others who influence and are influenced by healthcare and the healthcare system. To achieve this goal, PFC fosters a community of leading intellectuals, practitioners, and policymakers from a variety of backgrounds at all stages in their careers across Harvard University and across the world. If you are interested in health policy, bioethics, biotechnology topics, we encourage you to sign up for the Petrie-Flom Center newsletter and also to read the Petrie-Flom Center's Bill of Health blog, which features cutting-edge commentary by legal scholars. So PFC and CLBB are delighted to bring you this event together. Before we get to the main event, a logistical item, which is audience questions. We welcome audience questions for our speaker, so please do submit them. I will pose them to our speaker later in the event. So you may be asking, how do I submit questions? The best way to do so is to use the Zoom Q&A feature. So if you scroll toward the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a little button marked Q&A. Just type your question in there. I'll be checking it very frequently. You're also welcome to join the conversation or submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag 7sinsmemory. Again, it's hashtag 7sinsmemory. If you do submit a question on Twitter, then Petrie-Flom staff will move that question into the Zoom Q&A. Please do not try to submit questions via the raise your hand or chat features. We will not be checking either of those. Again, we will be checking the Q&A Zoom feature. And now, logistics complete, I will pass the baton to the remarkable and brilliant Dr. Judith Edersheim, founding co-director of CLBB and an assistant professor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, to introduce our speaker.
Melissa, thank you so much, and welcome to everyone who's here today. I'm very excited to be introducing my friend, my colleague, Professor Schacter. I'm grateful to our colleagues and friends at Petrie-Flom, at the law school, at William James, and I'm so pleased to see the turnout for this very important event. So I'm honored to be introducing Dan Schechter, Professor Dan Schechter, on this 20th anniversary of the first publication of the 7 Sins of Memory. I'm not going to read you his magnificent bio, it would take up the whole event, but I do want to remind you that he is the William Kenan Jr. Professor of Psychology and prior chair of the Psychology Department at Harvard for many years. He's won every sought-after award in his field. You can see the long list, well-deserved long list. He has been elected to both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. He's spent his career exploring the relationship between conscious and unconscious forms of memory, the nature of memory distortions, the effects of aging on memory, as well as memory and creativity. More personally, Dr. Schechter has been on the faculty of the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior almost since its inception. Why? Because as he's put it beautifully in the past, memory can involve both catastrophic forgetting and catastrophic remembering. In his 7 Sins of Memory, he explicitly addresses how memory can wreak havoc in the legal system, and he's been a powerful ally in our fight against wrongful convictions, against false confession, and false testimony in the legal system. So we're grateful for all that you've done, Dan, and all of your contributions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Schacter today.
Thank you very much for the very kind and much appreciated introduction. And I'm going to get going by sharing my screen, getting my slides up, and we're off. So it's really a pleasure to be here today to be able to talk about this updated edition of my book on the 7 Sins of Memory, which of course was initially published back in 2001. And it came out of my own involvement initially in the literature on memory errors, what psychologists call constructive memory. We're starting to do research in my lab on this topic from a cognitive neuroscience perspective in the late 90s. And in mulling through the literature, while I realized that psychologists and neuroscientists had known for decades that memory is subject to error and distortion, nobody had really put together in one package kind of an organizational framework for thinking about the various ways in which memory can fail us. And so I sort of set that out as my task. I initially wrote an article in 1999 in the American Psychologist, and then wrote the book that was published in 2001 on the 7 Sins of Memory. And that reflected my conclusion that my best read of the literature was that we could break down memory errors into 7 different categories, or what I called sins by analogy with the 7 ancient deadly sins. So just reviewing them for those who are not familiar, the original postulation, I had 3 sins of what I called omission, sins of omission, different kinds of forgetting, basically. Transience, referring to the decreasing accessibility of memory over time. I think we all know intuitively that memories fade over time, become less accessible as time passes. A second kind of forgetting I talked about, I labeled absent-mindedness. So the result is the same as transience, forgetting, but the underlying mechanism is quite different. Here there's a breakdown at the interface of attention and memory, so lapses of attention that result in forgetting to do things. A third kind of forgetting that I talked about, I called blocking. So this refers to the temporary inaccessibility of stored information. So memory hasn't faded over time as with transience. We're paying attention, we're trying to remember, so it's not absent-mindedness, but we just can't come up with some bit of information we want to at the moment that we need that information. Tip of the tongue experience would be kind of the paradigmatic example of blocking. And we know the information is stored in memory and it's temporarily inaccessible because we can often retrieve it later on. The next 3 sins I called sins of commission. So this is when memory is present but wrong. Misattribution occurs when we attribute memories to an incorrect source. So we might correctly remember some new fact that we acquired and think that our friend told us that fact when in fact we heard it on the radio. This can result in a phenomenon known as false recognition that I'll talk about in more detail later. Closely related to misattribution is a sin I call suggestibility. So here, memories are implanted through suggestion, through the presentation of misinformation, the kind of work that probably many of you are familiar with from the classic studies of Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues on the topic of suggestibility that can in some cases result in full-blown false memories of events that never occurred, but were suggested to an individual. Bias refers to retrospective distortions produced by our current knowledge and beliefs. So this is when what we currently know, believe, and feel skews our memory of the past. And then the 7th sin I called persistence, and this refers to unwanted recollections that we really can't forget even though we wish that we could. So we're talking here about disturbing or even traumatic experiences that can keep us up at night and cause psychological harm. So that's another sin of commission. So the original book was structured around the 7 sins. I wrote a chapter on each one. And then importantly, there was a concluding chapter, which I think contained, in my mind, perhaps the most important message of the book. And here I raise the question of whether the 7 sins are really sins. And I tried to argue, in fact, that that it's a mistake to conceive of the 7 sins as design flaws that would expose memory as a fundamentally defective system. In contrast, I suggested that the 7 sins are byproducts of otherwise adaptive features of memory, a price we pay for processes and functions that serve us well in many respects. So this is the idea that the 7 sins really aren't design flaws, rather they're costs that we pay for benefits in memory. And we're going to get back to that point later on. So that was the original book published back in 2001. So here is the 20th anniversary new edition that was published just about a month ago. And this arose because there was some interest in my publisher, Houghton Mifflin, about whether I might be interested in updating the book. A long time had passed since the original 2001 version. Obviously, a lot of things had happened in memory research in the ensuing 20 years, and I thought this might be an interesting thing to do to kind of gauge where we've come since 2001. Now, one way you could approach this is just to write a whole new book, because that much has happened since 2001 that one really could write a whole new book on the 7 sins of memory. But the way I approached it was to try to basically keep the 2001 book, those chapters, more or less intact. I made some minor revisions when, for example, a phenomenon I talked about in 2001, it turns out is not replicable, or we've learned something that it wouldn't validate what was said back in 2001. Fortunately, there are very few cases of that kind, but I made a few changes in the main text. But the main way I updated it was for each sin to write 2 updates about developments that I thought were either particularly noteworthy from a scientific theoretical perspective or from the perspective of the implications for everyday life. So for each of the 7 sins, I wrote 2 updates around 1,500, 2,000 words each. And then for the concluding chapter on adaptive perspectives, I also wrote 2 updates. So that would be 16 updates. I can't go through all 16 now. We would be here for far too long, but I'm going to go through a few of them for you. And here is my plan for the talk. I will talk about 2 of the updates that I wrote for the chapter on transience, and then talk about 2 for the chapter on absent-mindedness. We'll then skip over to misattribution and talk about one of the updates I wrote for that chapter, and then I will link it to the updates I wrote for the chapter on adaptive perspectives, which tied into the work on misattribution. Okay, so let's move right ahead and talk about the first update for transience, which I called anti-transience, for reasons that I think will become clear. So this topic of anti-transience arose from a really interesting case study that was reported in the journal Neurocase back in 2006 by Parker, Cahill, and McGaugh from UC Irvine. They called this a case of unusual autobiographical remembering. And what they described here was a woman who they referred to by the initials AJ, you can see on the screen from the abstract that I pulled out of the article, who had an unusual kind of memory. Her memory, as written in the abstract, is nonstop, uncontrollable, and automatic. So this is someone who is just caught up in remembering her personal past, and remarkably seems to be able to remember just about any event that had ever happened to her. So if you give her a date, the researchers find she could tell you exactly what she was doing and what happened on that date. And she kept diaries, so the researchers could check and see, is she really remembering accurately? And she was. So to get a feel for it, if I say to you, well, try to remember what you were doing on May 12th, 2008, the chances are you're not going to be able to come up with any specific memory. Well, AJ could, and that was quite remarkable. They initially called this syndrome hyperthymetic Mestick syndrome, but changed it in ways that I'll mention in a minute. Well, this case ended up generating a lot of interest, and AJ was interviewed on 60 Minutes and in fact came out and revealed her true identity. Her real name is Jill Price. She wrote a book that was published a couple of years later all about her memory. And as a result of this, the 60 Minutes piece, a number of other people came forward and say, hey, I have a memory just like that. Well, McGaugh and colleagues developed a screening device so that they could actually tell, who really had this kind of incredibly detailed memory. And they used fairly restrictive criteria, and they found that very few people actually had this, but there were a number of them from across the country. And again, there was a 60 Minutes piece devoted to them, and many of you may have seen that before. And they also altered the name of this condition, and what it's known as today is highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM. Okay, so why do I call this anti-transience? Well, here's an interesting study that was published in 2016 out of from McGaugh and colleagues. By now, they had amassed a group of 30 individuals with HSAM. And what they found is that these folks were able to recall a lot more detail from everyday events than you and I, control participants, would a month after they occurred, but there were no differences a week after the events occurred. So it seemed as though the normal process of forgetting or transience over time was being halted or slowed down in this group. The HSAM group also showed more OCD symptoms than controls, which is a finding that's been replicated a number of times. And more OCD symptoms correlated with more detailed recall at the 1-month delay. So one idea coming out of this work might be that, hey, these folks are obsessively reviewing their past, and that's where this kind of anti-transience comes from. If you do enough retrieval and rehearsal, you're going to prevent the normal forgetting process. Well, there's another line of work that only really came to prominence after I wrote The 7 Sins of Memory in 2001 that ties in with this very nicely, and it's known as the testing effect. So we know and have known for decades that testing of memory not only assesses what we know, but can change it, and it can enhance later performance more than studying information over and over again. If you self-test, it boosts memory even more than additional study. So a question that was addressed in this work was whether testing can slow down forgetting over time, as we just saw HSAM seems to do. And there's a well-known study by the psychologists Roddy Roediger and Jeff Karpicki, published 2006, Psychological Science, where they had students study prose passages, and they either restudied the passage or they took a test. They were asked to freely recall what was in the passage. They weren't given any feedback about whether it was right or wrong, and the test was scored for the number of idea units from the prose passages that they came up with. There were 3 different groups of subjects who were given a final test 5 minutes, 2 days, or 1 week after the initial study and test phases. What happened? Well, if you look at the 5-minute delay, and we're comparing the group that studied twice versus the group that studied and then took a free recall test before this final free recall test, you can see there's actually a slight advantage for the study group. So maybe cramming helps you if you're tested 5 minutes later. But as you can see, by 2 days out, the test group is showing a huge advantage, and that holds over a week. So there is some forgetting over time for the study test group, but it's about half what you see in the group that studies twice. So pulling those 2 things together, we have evidence that this self-testing, or retrieval practice, some people call it, can act as a kind of anti-transience, and that seems to be perhaps a good explanation, or at least a partial explanation, of what's going on with HSAM. All right, second update for the transience chapter has to do with the topic that really wasn't much discussed when I wrote the 7 Sins of Memory back in 2001, something that's really just come online in the last 20 years. And that concerns the effect of technology on memory. Google, smartphones, social media, GPS, Are they friends or enemies of transients? Are they helping or hurting our memories? Now, you have probably read many of the same articles I have, which sort of doomsaying about whether, is Google ruining our memory? The implication is that it might be. We're relying on Google. We're not interrogating our own memories. Maybe our memories are just going to suffer as a consequence. There's a Washington Post article, how the internet is ruining your memory. So it's no longer a question, it's just stated as a fact. Here's an opinion piece that was written in the Washington Post in June 2019. Ditch the GPS, it's ruining your brain. So there's a lot of this kind of doomsaying out there about how technology may be ruining our memories. And if you pay attention to some recent news events, you might be tempted to agree with this. For example, here's an article that appeared in the Boston Globe in June about an SUV driver who got stuck on the 6th tee of the Braeburn Country Club golf course. I might add a location that Dr. Edersheim, I believe, is familiar with, a downhill, very beautiful par 3. Well, this guy drove his SUV onto the 6th tee as a result of following his GPS, his Waze application. It told him to go on the golf course, and he was driving at night, so there's a little bit of an excuse there, but there he went. Some of you might remember a funny example, a funny episode of The Office where Michael drives his car into a lake following GPS instructions. So this kind of stuff, hey, maybe there's something to it. Maybe we're so reliant on these external devices that we're really messing up our memories. Well, so I talk about this in the chapter. I'm not going to go into detail on all these different areas, but on the effects of internet and the computer, Google effects of taking and reviewing photos, for example, on Instagram and on GPS. And to boil it down, I think that there are some negative effects, but I think they're, at least in terms of what's been shown, much more modest than some would have you believe. And there are also some positive effects. For those who are interested, I took a deeper dive into this topic, building on what I wrote in this update for 7 Sins, in an article for a new journal, Memory, Mind, and Media, that's coming online in 2022. This is the inaugural article for that journal. They asked me to write it, and so I just sort of plunged a little bit deeper into this topic and talked about the sins of memory and effects of media and technology. And the basic conclusion I reached is that the effects that have been demonstrated of media and technology on memory, at least of a negative sort, really are largely what I call task-specific effects. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take the GPS example. There is evidence in the literature that if you rely on GPS during navigation of a route, for example, in an experiment where you're doing a simulated route, and you compare the memory of people who are relying on GPS versus those who are not, there is poor memory for the route if you rely on GPS. I would call that a task-specific effect. But are there more general effects? So a domain-specific effect would be if you rely on GPS, is there a more general effect such that your ability to establish and retain over time spatial memories in general is impacted? And there's very little evidence for that. And then finally, what I call a domain general effect would be if you rely on GPS, is that having an even broader effect where not only spatial memory is impaired, but all other kinds of memory for everyday events, memory for facts, and so forth. And for that kind of effect, I would say there is yet no evidence. Not to say there never will be, but my take is that that some of the doomsaying is just a bit overstated. And again, I talk about that in the book and also in this article. Okay, let's now talk about absent-mindedness. And there are 2 updates I wrote there. One has to do with phrasing, using the phrase that Judy Edersheim mentioned in the introduction, where we see a truly catastrophic kind of forgetting that sadly results from basic principles of what produces absent-minded forgetting. And so this first update has to do with something probably many of you are familiar with from the news, sad phenomenon of forgotten children. So I first became aware of this when I got a call from an attorney shortly after the publication of the original Seven Sins of Memory book. He in fact had read the book, which came out in spring 2001, and got in touch with me about the case reflected here in this newspaper article from Iowa, where the situation was that a woman by the name of Carrie Engholm discovered the body of her infant daughter Claire in her minivan at the end of her workday on June 26, having driven her older son and Claire. She was supposed to drop them both off at daycare, and dropped off Eric and forgot about Claire back in the back seat. It was a hot day, and tragically, the infant died in the back seat. Engholm was an administrator at a hospital. She testified at her trial that she routinely took Claire to a babysitter and then took her son Eric to a daycare center. But on that day, she's running late and dropped off her son first, and then kind of operating on automatic, she continued on to work as she normally would, forgetting she had her daughter in the minivan. She said she was preoccupied with some meetings coming up at work, and because the infant's in the back seat, she has no retrieval cue to remind her that the infant is there. What happened, the judge ultimately said that this was an involuntary process of forgetting that can't be knowingly or recklessly done. Whether it should be condemned or condoned is not the point. The fact is Carrie Engholm forgot. So she was acquitted of the felony neglect charge that had been brought against her. Well, I think as many of us know, this is not just an isolated incident. I was shocked by this when I got this call from the attorney, and my assessment was largely in line with the judge's assessment here, because I'd never heard of a case like this before. And in fact, it only really started around that time because just a couple of years earlier, that law required car seats to be put in the back seat for obvious safety reasons. You would never think that that could produce a problem with forgetting because the child is no longer visible, but sadly it has. There's a terrific article that was written about this by Gene Weingarten in the Washington Post in 2009, and the question is it a crime? Well, in about 40% of cases he assessed until that point, police don't bring charges, and in the 60% where charges are brought, typically some type of plea or compromise is reached. And now in most of these cases, parents report operating on autopilot, being absorbed in thinking about work or another task, the child's in the back seat, and no retrieval cues available to remind them. Now, it seems crazy that anyone would think you would need a retrieval cue to remind you to remove a child from a car. But in fact, this really all follows from the discussion I had in the 2001 book about the principles of prospective memory, remembering to carry out an act in the future. And one of the points I made there, I never imagined it would apply to a situation like this, is that when a retrieval cue is not present at the moment you need it, you can forget almost anything. And this is an example of exactly that, sadly. However, there is help, and there is help from technology. There are now a number of reminder devices that have been made available to help with this problem, because as pointed out in this ad for the eClip, the baby reminder for your car, at least 800 cases of this kind have been reported over the past 20 years. Now, how does the eClip work? You attach the eClip to a car seat, seatbelt or diaper, as pointed out in the ad. You connect it to an app on your phone, and it will alert you if you move more than 25 feet from the vehicle, or if the temperature in your car is too hot or too cold. So you can never exhibit this kind of forgetting if you've got that eClip on. Now, the challenge here is that many or most people think, oh, I would never forget my own infant in a car, but these 800 cases indicate that, yeah, it is possible, and I hope that people make use of these kinds of devices. Okay, second update for absent-mindedness has to do with a really interesting phenomenon of mind wandering. So mind wandering is something that occurs when people engage in thoughts that are unrelated to a primary cognitive task at hand. Mind wandering was really not on the landscape of psychologists when I wrote the book on 7 Sins of Memory back in 2001, but it's become a huge topic of investigation since that time. Two people who deserve a lot of credit for that are Jonathan Smallwood and Jonathan Schooler, who wrote, among other things, a very influential psychological bulletin article in 2006 that kind of crystallized the concept, introduced methods for studying it. And one area where mind wandering is relevant to those of us who teach and in lecture settings is what I'm showing you here. We have a group of students who are eagerly waiting, we hope, to hear from us during our lecture, equipped with laptops, but we suspect that if we look on the other side, we might see evidence of mind wandering. There could be some online shopping, YouTube viewing, Instagram or Facebook, people's minds wandering away from the task at hand. And in fact, there is, sadly, for those of us who do this, a lot of evidence that mind wandering occurs frequently during classroom lectures. So in one study where students were probed during a psychology lecture, roughly a third of the time, they would report that, no, I'm not focused on the lecture, my mind is off somewhere else. And importantly, this is negatively correlated with learning of lecture content, not surprisingly. So it qualifies in my framework as a kind of absent-minded forgetting, a breakdown at the interface of attention and memory. Well, is there anything that can be done to reduce mind wandering and increase attention to promote memory? We took this on in my lab back in 2013 in a study where we employed the testing effect, a different aspect of the testing effect that we talked about a few minutes ago. So there's some evidence that giving tests from lab studies after each of several word lists can enhance attention to studied information and increase performance on a final test. So here what's happening is I tell you, hey, I'm going to test your memory for this information, and then I intermittently do test you. That gets people really to ramp up their attention to the target material because they want to be able to process it and remember it. So it's working in a different way than the kind of retrieval practice aspect of the testing effect that we talked about earlier. Here, knowing you're going to be tested increases your attention and hopefully would reduce mind wandering. So we published a study on this back in 2013 where I asked this question. We used a videotaped statistics lecture, lasted about 20 minutes. We were attempting to model online learning, which of course has become much more prevalent in the past decade. We divided the lecture into 4 segments, and these segments were separated either by brief tests, where you would be asked about something in the previous lecture segment, math problems, or by restudying the information, or you're actually shown the fact that people in the tested group would be tested on. And participants in all the conditions were instructed at the beginning that the lecture would be divided into 4 segments, and it would be randomly determined whether they were tested after each segment, and also that there would be a final test. But only one group actually received these interpolated tests. The others were told that they would, but they never actually got the test. So what happened? Well, first let's look on the left at the data on mind wandering, because we probed them intermittently and asked them during the lecture, are you focused on the lecture or are you mind wandering? So in the RS, the restudy group, or the NT, the non-tested group, we pretty much replicated what others had previously found. Around 35 to 40% of the time, those folks are saying, no, I'm not really paying attention to the lecture. My mind is wandering off to, what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, or the movie I saw last night, things of that sort. In the tested group, you can see we cut mind wandering in half. We didn't eliminate it, but we cut it in half. They were allowed to take notes on the lecture. People in the tested group did a lot more of that. And then you can see when we looked at correct responses in when we tested them for the final segment, there was a significant advantage of people in the tested group in retention of target information. So we followed up, extended this work, and others have since that time, and it seems as though this interpolated testing, which a lot of people are using in their online lectures nowadays, really can combat absent-minded forgetting. All right, let's move on now and talk a little bit about misattribution, which earlier I talked about as attributing memories to an incorrect source, and talk a little bit about false recognition, and then we'll see how that plays out in the adaptive perspective. So one of my updates for the misattribution chapter is titled, "Have we found the truth machine yet?" What's that all about? Well, that really stems from something highly relevant to the CLBB, namely that we heard about in Dr. Edershine's introduction, the data concerning eyewitness misidentifications that have led to wrongful convictions. So we know, probably many of you are familiar with a graph like this, that as a result of DNA evidence, many people have been exonerated of crimes that they didn't commit. And this graph from the Innocence Project shows that among the first 325 DNA exonerations, I believe that number is now up to 350, about 72% of those involve some sort of eyewitness misidentification. In my terms, a misattribution of some kind, where they're saying, yeah, that was the person, but they are somehow misattributing that their sense of familiarity with that person that arose from some other experiences. So we have this big problem, and that raises the question, of course, well, can we distinguish between, is there a way to convincingly distinguish between when somebody is accurately remembering versus when they're falsely remembering? Obviously, that would be something that could really hopefully cut down on this kind of tragic misattribution. Well, psychologists have been grappling with this problem, and in this article written by Bernstein and Loftus, about 15 years ago, they concluded that it might be virtually impossible to tell reliably if a particular memory is true or false without independent corroboration. So for that reason, a lot of people have wondered, well, what about neuroimaging? We and others have done over the last 25 years, a lot of research on the brain and memory using the technique of functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which allows us to look in a very precise way at what parts of the brain become active when we remember, when we forget, and so forth. And back in the 1990s, a novelist by the name of James Halperin wrote a novel called The Truth Machine, where he envisaged a future in which neuroimaging had come so far that we could now reliably distinguish truth from lies, true memories from false memories. So what has happened over the last 20 years with fMRI research on true versus false memories? We had actually gotten started on this, prior to the publication of the 2001 version of the 7 Sins of Memory book. There's been a tremendous amount more research on this topic since then. Here's one of the standard kind of paradigms that some of you may be familiar with for investigating true and false memories in the laboratory. It's known as the Dease-Roediger-McDermott, or DRM paradigm, named after the people who initially came up with this paradigm, James Dease back in 1959, and then Roddy Roediger and Kathleen McDermott kind of rediscovered the paradigm and modified it in 1995. And it's a very simple way to, under laboratory control, induce a particular kind of misattribution, false recognition type of memory. So participants study semantic associates that all converge on a non-presented theme word. Sometimes it's called the false target. So you might hear a list, for example, such as candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, etc. And then you're later tested with words that were actually on the study list, like taste, unrelated words that weren't on the study list and have nothing to do with the words that were, such as point, and the associatively related theme word, critical lure, false target, such as sweet. And the critical finding here is that if you've heard candy, sour, sugar, bitter, all those words that are related to sweet, you will false alarm at a high level to the word sweet. You'll swear up and down that you heard sweet on the list when in fact you didn't. You'll give it your highest confidence rating. Well, we and then later others put this paradigm into the scanner to ask the question, are there any differences in brain activity when you remember a word like taste that you really did hear on the list earlier on versus sweet that you just think you heard but didn't hear? And here's an example of a finding from a study by Abe et al. That replicated an earlier finding from my lab and extended it with some more sophisticated analysis techniques. And basically what they showed that there were several areas of the brain, even though there are many similarities between true and false recognition, there were a few areas that showed increased activity when you correctly remembered a word like taste that you had actually heard versus when you falsely remembered a word like sweet that you just thought you heard. And it was areas involved in language processing and also auditory processing that showed this increased activity, suggesting that maybe for the words you had actually heard, there was some sort of auditory reactivation that left kind of a sensory signature of the actual experience. And in other studies from my lab conducted around this time, I don't have time to go into now, we showed the same thing for visual information, that there's a visual sensory signature for shapes that you had actually seen versus similar looking shapes that you hadn't seen, but you thought that you did. So the question is, does this get us closer to using the truth machine in the courtroom? Well, Elizabeth Loftus and I co-authored an article on this in 2013 in Nature Neuroscience, and I talk about this in the update in the book. We're still skeptical about the application of this technology in the courtroom for a number of reasons. In the lab, we're typically using highly constrained and artificial materials. We have very tight control over the input, and we're testing memory at brief delays. But in the real world, we're often dealing with richer autobiographical memories. We have no control over the input, and we're looking at longer delays. Lab studies of true versus false memories have typically used undergraduate participants. And of course, we encounter more diverse populations in the courtroom. And probably most important, in the studies I just talked about, and in most, not all studies nowadays, we're averaging across groups of people. But in the courtroom, of course, we want to know about an individual's memory. We're averaging across collections of items and events. But in the courtroom, of course, we want to know about one specific item or event. So have we gotten to the point where we can, look at one person and tell whether they're truly, accurately or falsely remembering, for example, a face? There is a little evidence on that. Some work from Anthony Wagner's lab, led by Jesse Rissman, showed that researchers could use fMRI to determine whether a single participant subjectively recognized a face presented earlier. They could decode that from their fMRI signal, but they couldn't decode whether the person had actually seen the face. They couldn't determine the objective status of the memory. All they could do was decode whether a person subjectively recognized the face, but it's really the latter that we need evidence on in the courtroom. So for this reason, we're skeptical about the current application. Okay, then the final 5 minutes, I just want to talk about how misattribution relates to adaptive perspectives that have arisen since the publication of the original book in 2001. So I talked about this idea that the 7 sins reflect adaptive features of memory in 2001, but it was largely, I have to admit, a theoretical argument at the time. There wasn't a lot of evidence on that point. Now, however, and I review some of this in the new book, there is quite a bit more evidence, much more evidence than I had to work with back in 2001. I'll just give you one quick example related to the paradigm we just discussed, the false recognition paradigm. Now, these false memories are probably driven by semantic information and relations. So in other words, sweet is meaningfully related to all those words in the list, and you're probably retaining that semantic information, and that's what's driving your misattribution, your false memory. Well, if semantic information and relations are critical in driving these DRM false memories, then brain regions involved in representing this kind of information, which of course is crucial for our cognitive function and highly adaptive, should play a role in false recognition of the critical lure word. And one such region is known as the temporal pole. That's the highlighted region in orange here at the front of the temporal lobe. It's been called the semantic hub of the brain. It's been implicated when damaged in semantic dementia. So I was collaborated on an fMRI study that I'm just going to mention here. I can't go into the details, where we were able to use fMRI to link semantic representations in the left temporal pole directly with the generation of DRM false memories. It's published in PNAS 2016 for anyone who's interested. Here, an adaptive process, semantic representation, crucial to our cognitive function, gives rise to a memory misattribution. And then the final topic I'll briefly mention, then we'll go on to questions. In the second update for the chapter on adaptive function, I call episodic recombination, past, present, and future. And that's because this new focus on episodic recombination emerged from a line of research in my lab that only began in 2007, that I really didn't have in my mind at all when I wrote the 2001 book, on the way in which memory is not only important for remembering the past, but also for imagining the future. So back in 2007, Donna Rosada, shown in the picture here, she and I developed a fMRI paradigm where we looked at what goes on in the brain when people remember past experiences and imagine future experiences. So we gave participants a cue word. So for example, if we gave them a cue word such as vacation and instructed them to remember a related past event during scanning, you see the thought bubble on the left. The participant says, I remember, or thinks, I remember taking a day trip last summer and walking on the beach. So there's an example of remembering a past event. In the other thought bubble, I imagine picking out a puppy at the pet shop next year. That would be in response to a cue word such as dog and instructions to imagine a future event. Well, the striking thing to come out of this study was that the brain maps looked very similar when you remembered a past event compared to a control task, or imagined a future event compared to a control task. These midline regions that I'm showing you here, the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate retrosplenial cortex, showed similar activation. So did a few other regions. And based on that study and a couple of others that were available at the time, Addis, Randy Buckner, and I, in a 2007 Nature Reviews Neuroscience article, postulated the existence of a core network involved in remembering past events, imagining future events, and related kinds of mental simulations. Shown here, those midline regions I just showed you, medial temporal lobe, including hippocampus, and a couple of other regions as well. Well, based on those findings and some other findings of striking similarities between remembering the past and imagining the future, for example, amnesic patients who of course have problems remembering the past, most of them also have problems imagining personal future experiences. Addis and I put forth an idea called a constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. And there we argued that retrieval of episodic memories plays a key role in imagining or simulating possible future scenarios. It does so, we argued, by supporting the flexible retrieval and recombination of elements of stored episodes to construct possible future episodes. We suggested that this process of flexible episodic recombination is adaptive when we're trying to use memory for future simulation, because the future is rarely identical to the past, so we need to be able to simulate novel situations based on past experience. And our episodic memory allows us to do so by recombining bits and pieces of our past experience to run simulations of novel upcoming events. But here's where we get back to the 7 sins. We argued that this episodic recombination process can also result in memory errors when elements of past experience are miscombined. And in fact, we and others now in the past few years have provided some evidence in support of this last point, that episodic recombination can result in memory errors. I've just highlighted a couple of studies from my lab on this point. I'll just leave them up here for anyone who's interested in tracking them down. They basically show that episodic recombination processes that in this case are used to make inferences about the relations between events can also produce false memories. And we've provided some fMRI evidence to show the underlying basis of how this episodic recombination process results in the reinstatement of false neural patterns that can fool us into thinking that we've experienced an event that we have not actually experienced. And the result of that is, or the underlying basis of that is an adaptive process that allows us to make links between different events in our lives, but also through episodic recombination of a similar kind to what we think is going on when people imagine future events, also can result in misattributed memories. So that's all I've got for the talk portion. I'll just leave the pretty picture of that cover. I like that cover they gave me, and be happy to answer questions in our remaining time.
Thank you so much, Professor Schacter. That was really interesting. On the baby in the backseat front, I was recently in a parenting class, and a lower tech solution was suggested, which is to put a baby sock over the door handle before you get out of the car. But that is a recognized issue.
Good.
Yes. So some questions that have come in our remaining time. One is whether you could comment on aging and the 7 sins, and also whether there's any sense of why certain individuals are more susceptible to certain of the sins of memory than others.
Yeah, good questions. In general, I think it's the case that it was the case probably when I wrote the book in 2001, and to some extent, and I think is still the case today. If we walk through the 7 sins, we'd say that in most instances, aging kind of somewhat makes them each of these sins somewhat worse, but that's not always the case. So, for example, we talk about when I talk about work on bias, which I didn't get into today. There is evidence that as we get older, we're biased toward retrieving more positive or pleasant memories than when we're younger, which can be a beneficial thing. But for most of the 7 sins, aging, I think, makes them somewhat worse. We know, of course, that there are constraints on that. For example, we talked about absent-mindedness, and when you put people in experiments where they have to do prospective memory tasks, remembering to carry out tasks in the future, older adults really suffer if they don't have retrieval cues to allow them to remember what to do. But when retrieval cues are provided, then older adults do just fine. So it really depends on the particulars of the specific memory failure, even within each sin that we would talk about. Individual differences in memory are still a topic that really needs a lot more work. We talked about HSAM at the beginning. Now, there's a very striking individual difference. One of the reasons for that we discussed is that these are folks who spend a lot of time rehearsing, rehashing their memories. And there have been fMRI studies, I go through them in the update in the book, didn't have time to get into them in the talk, that show some differences in brain structure and function that may be related to those differences in memory. And there have been other studies as well that have been linking underlying differences in brain patterns to individual differences in memory.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is sort of concern about how courts handle false confessions and false testimony, and wondering whether there are any implications for the legal process and sort of safeguards that could be in place that would sort of safeguard truth from fallibility of memory. So, requiring more than one source in all instances, or sort of just what your take is on that problem?
Well, in fact, I do talk about some, in my update on suggestibility, I talk about some of the cases, sort of horrific cases of false confession that have arisen since 2001. And they're complex cases, but I would boil it down to a really a more general point about suggestibility in memory. The best way to avoid suggestive false memories is understanding what not to do. So if you don't provide leading questions, and in the case of false confessions, this is often the case. There are leading questions, there's pressure, and so forth that results in a false confession, and simply not engaging in those practices, as with other forms of suggestibility, is one of the best ways to avoid the possibility of that happening. So I think some of the suggestions just mentioned are good ones. And you can, we go back to the 1990s, some of the pioneering work on children's false memories from Stephen Ceci and Maggie Brooke showed how leading questions from investigators could produce false memories in young children. And so again, I think the main point is knowing what not to do.
Thank you. Another question is sort of the workings of memory. If a memory is more likely to be retrievable if the original experience was sort of an image or something that could be imagined, or if it is linked with some sort of earlier event that was experienced.
Yeah, yes to all of those. I think those are some of the basic principles of memory encoding that are discussed in the book and really come from a work prior to 2001. Certainly linking new information with prior knowledge is one of the most important ways of establishing a rich framework or scaffolding for a memory that makes it later retrievable. We know that imagination is something that can enhance encoding of new information. On the downside, this is where we cross the line from encoding new information in effective ways into false memories. Imagination, unfortunately, is also something that can lead to suggested memories. And I think one of the insights from the work that I talked about on similar brain mechanisms underlying remembering the past and imagining the future is that we realize that memory and imagination depend on most of the same brain regions, so that when we imagine an event, we're activating many of the same brain regions that are involved when we remember an event. So imagination has these, I think, these dual effects. At encoding, it can be a powerful way of establishing a new memory, but at retrieval, it can sometimes result in false suggested memories.
Final question, as we are up at time. You have told us a great deal about the sins of memory, and was wondering if there is a virtue of memory that you would like to highlight.
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question, because again, that's one of the main points I discussed even back in 2001 in that concluding chapter. I think really one of the main virtues of memory is that it allows us to retain a lot of the important things that have happened to us, emotionally arousing information that we elaborate on and relate to what we already know, while not burdening us with a lot of trivia and details of events and information that we really don't want to remember. So I think one of the main virtues of memory, and I do give credence to this in that final chapter, is that it's a very efficient system that allows us to really attune with the important things in our lives and remember them well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for your attention, and enjoyed being able to talk.
Bye all.